There have been polls, some of them taken by Florida International University, where it's clear that a majority of Cubans support a change in policy, including a change in the embargo. So attitudes have changed dramatically, and I think the president is on solid political ground in making this shift.
For more than 50 years, Cuba's remained a nation where people are dying to be free, and that means leaving any way they can. And one that Americans really know very little about, save for the smuggled pieces of information. So let's welcome to MidPoint, Professor of Government at American University, co-author of the fascinating book, Back Channel to Cuba, The Hidden History of Negotiations Between Washington and Havana. William LeoGrande joins us today. William, thank you so much for being here.
Glad to be with you.
All right, let's talk about your trip to Cuba, Bill, because you were actually there on the ground when the president announced his new edicts, if you will. What was the reaction there, or did the people really know much when it actually happened?
Oh, people were very, very much aware of it. There was really jubilation in Cuba because people felt like it was equivalent to the end of a war, the end of 50 years of hostility between the two countries. And I think a lot of Cubans expect that as a result of this, U.S.-Cuban economic relations are going to expand and the Cuban economy will get better. I mean, they've been told for 50 years that the U.S. embargo was one of the main reasons for economic problems on the island. So they think the normalization of relations means an end to the embargo and therefore economic growth.
Now there's part of the issue. Let me stop you there for a sec, because
Sure.
Isn't it possible that while the Cuban people there think, wonderful, embargo stopped, things are going to get better, that they're being still played to this day to the nth degree by the Castro regime?
Well, the embargo hasn't gone away, of course. That wasn't part of the agreement. The embargo, for the most part, is still very much in place. But the Cuban government under Raul Castro has actually been a lot more candid about its own economic problems. For the last several years, he's been warning Cubans that the problem is as much their own domestic economic model as it is the embargo. And he gave a speech to the Cuban National Assembly just 2 days ago in which he tried to lower expectations about whether better relations with the United States was going to cause any quick changes in the economic situation.
We hear an awful lot, and again, as I mentioned, only 90 miles away from the United States, but we hear so many stories about Cuba. We hear that it's people that are poverty-stricken, and of course we know about the fact that the infrastructure is very difficult, and the fact that the government lives high on the hog. You've been there, you're on the ground. What's the reality of the situation with regard to the Cuban people?
Well, it is a poor country, and a lot of Cubans, particularly those who are working in the state sector of the economy and are paid in Cuban pesos, which are not worth very much in dollar terms, they scrape to get by. You don't see the kind of wrenching poverty that you do in some countries because they do have free health care, free education, the cost of housing is relatively low. But one of the things that's happened in the last few years is a growing gap between the haves and the have-nots as the economy has become more market-oriented.
With regard to that disparity between the haves and the have-nots, we're going to talk about that after the break a little bit, but let me broach it now for just a moment. Do you really think, and are the people there, well, let's get your opinion first. Do you really think that if things do change here, that that gap will shrink? Because it would seem to some that the Cuban government, they kind of love having their big houses right now, their newer cars and everything they have. Why should they give it away under a communistic flag?
No, actually, the inequality, I think, is going to be getting wider. As the government allows more free play of the market, there are some winners and there are some losers. There are people who are doing very, very well in their private restaurants and their private farms. And then there's people in the state sector of the economy who are being laid off from their jobs as the state enterprises have to now begin to compete with the private sector. So it's not so much the bureaucrats taking privileges, although there is some of that, but it's really the operation of the market itself that's exaggerating some of the inequalities.
All right, 15 seconds before we take a break. Do you think the president got it right?
I do think he got it right. There's still a long way to go. There's still a lot of issues between Cuba and the United States. But I think he changed the framework in the same way that Nixon did when he went to China in 1972.
Okay, please stand by just a couple of moments here. More with Professor William LeoGrande after the break. The reality of what to expect and what we can gain from Cuba with more Americans on the ground. And here's always a great question. Why anybody should trust that government and why they trust it'll change once the Castros do die out. Will happen eventually. We'll Coming back on MidPoint.